One of my all-time favorite stories is the approach that we took when SCIP reporting was becoming a pressing requirement. And the story itself is a bit of an interesting story, both about EU politics as well as the whole approach that's taken there. Because the requirement to set up a SCIP database came into the Waste Framework Directive very, very late, I think in 2018. And that was kind of a last minute action by the EU Parliament just before Christmas. So no other EU body had any chance to react or anything. And there was a bit of a scramble from what I understood going on in the background between how things should be done and should be approached. Because at the end of the day, there was also a discussion to have kind of a survey running, an investigation going on about how well the REACH Article 33 requirements, meaning the reporting requirements within the supply chain, were actually being met and fulfilled. Because there is an obligation, if you have a substance of very high concern above 0.1% in your product, you are required to notify your customer in a B2B environment about that. But with no enforcement, that can be done or cannot be done. So there were plans to look into how well that was executed, but then kind of Parliament took the speed lane and put a requirement for a database. At least this is my understanding. I'm not an expert in EU politics, definitely, but that is my understanding, that this came up into the regulation as a surprise for everybody. And the paragraph where this is in is very short. So there's just a bare minimum description of what needs to be done. Reporting requirement was starting at the beginning of 2021, in the first days of January 2021. At the beginning of 2020, the European Chemicals Agency started to really look into how to set up that database. And of course, they were struggling as well because there was a requirement, but there were no detailed framework conditions given. And they set up an IT working group to bring solution providers and organizations together. We were part of that. And they were basically working out things, developing things, discussing things. And what we did in parallel is set up user groups of our customers, where we discussed what came up in the IT user group and bounce that back with our customers and figure out what that meant for their day-to-day work and what a solution would look like or would need to look like to actually be effectively and efficient for them to work with. And that were really interesting times. So not somewhat different from what we're seeing now, but again, that whole situation of there is a requirement that needs to be met, and the requirement and the business reality somewhere need to come together for people to actually be able to fulfill the condition and to meet that. And so we were struggling back and forth and working our way back and forth with quite a number of hiccups on the way, due to the fact that despite the best efforts of the automotive industry, it seemed to me the message of how many parts actually are in a car that would need to be reported at the end of the day never really came across. So when reporting started, and the initial period was opened in October 2020 already, and the automotive OEM started to report the data sets, the European Chemicals Agency said we put a stop at 1,000 line items being declared, but that was a bit too small for actually the cars to really go through. So there were a lot of these dossiers actually stuck because they were bigger, and then there was a pending decision as to what should happen to these data sets. And at the end of the day, I think in February 2021, there was the decision to we will not process data sets larger than. So we were adjusting our solution, making use of some of the options that were there of referencing data sets to make sure that our customers could still send a dossier with one click, but in the background, these options that were available by the European Chemicals Agency were leveraged so that the data set still would go through. That were interesting times to figure out. And it was a good example of what I still like about it, of actually making sure that there was an approach of a practical approach, and that was operationally feasible to meet these requirements and to allow people to get things done without a lot of effort. And I think this is, at the end of the day, there is a legal requirement and somehow it needs to be operational to really work and to also make a legal requirement actually come to life.